Before the mountains were named, and before the seas were measured, there was an age known only to heaven. It was a time when the boundary between the eternal and the mortal was not yet sealed. The earth was young, its paths unwritten, and humanity still walked beneath a sky that watched closely. In those days, order flowed downward from the throne of the Most High. Light was given its course. The stars kept their appointed places. Angels were sent as guardians, watchers over the unfolding design. They were not born of dust, yet they were sent to dwell near it. They observed the generations of men. They measured time. They preserved instruction. Their purpose was clear and their authority was limited. Yet within this harmony, a quiet fracture appeared. From ancient fragments and forbidden records, a different memory rises. It speaks of watchers who lingered too long, of knowledge not meant to descend so quickly, of unions that altered flesh and spirit alike. From this crossing emerged beings of renown, vast in strength and presence. The Nephilim walked the earth, and with them rose an empire unlike any before or after. Cities were built, power was gathered, names were carved into stone and remembered in fear. The blood of heaven and earth mixed, and the world was changed by it. Violence increased. The voice of the earth cried out beneath the weight of corruption. Yet one question remains, written between the lines of Scripture and sealed within the silence of heaven. Why was this allowed to unfold? Why did judgment delay while the Nephilim ruled, taught, and dominated the ancient world? Was this rebellion unseen, or was it permitted for a time beyond human understanding? The answers are not spoken loudly. They are scattered across sacred texts, echoes in the Book of Enoch, shadows in Genesis, warnings whispered by prophets long after the giants were gone. To follow this story is to walk slowly through a vanished world, guided by remnants and divine restraint. This is not a tale of spectacle but of consequence, not of wonder alone, but of patience, justice, and mercy measured across ages. The path ahead unfolds slowly, as all ancient truths do, leading toward understanding and finally toward rest. In the beginning, before the counting of days, order was spoken into being. Not rushed, not forced, but set in place with calm intention. Light knew its boundary. Darkness did not resist it. The deep remained where it was told to remain. Above, the heavens were stretched wide, steady, and unmoving. Below, the earth rested in readiness, waiting for purpose to unfold. This was an age without fracture. Heaven and earth were distinct, yet closely aligned. Not joined as one, yet not distant. What was formed above moved in harmony with what was shaped below. The will of the Most High flowed without obstruction, like a quiet river that never overran its banks. All things were given their place. The stars were fixed in their courses, each one bearing a function beyond light alone. The seasons were appointed not as chance but as rhythm. Time itself was measured gently, unfolding without urgency. Nothing hurried toward its end, nothing pressed beyond its limit. Within this ordered expanse, angels were formed as servants of structure. They were not rulers of creation, nor were they observers without purpose. They were messengers, guardians, and witnesses. Their existence was bound to obedience. Their strength was matched by restraint. Their knowledge was given in measure. They moved according to command, not desire. Some were sent to the edges of creation. Others remained nearer to the throne. Many were assigned to the workings of the world below, not to govern it, but to observe and preserve what had been declared good. They watched the patterns of growth. They measured the passing of generations. They stood as living testimony to the design that had been spoken. Authority was clear in those days. It did not shift or compete. It descended in order, from the Most High to the heavens, from the heavens to the earth. Each level served the one above it. Each level protected the one beneath it. There was no confusion of role and therefore no conflict of will. This hierarchy was not oppression, it was alignment. Power did not exist for domination but for stability. Knowledge was not scattered freely but entrusted carefully. Every command carried purpose. Every boundary carried meaning. Obedience was not demanded through fear but sustained through understanding. In this early world, harmony was maintained because all beings remained within what had been appointed. Angels did not seek to rule what they were meant to guard. Humanity, still in its first generations, walked without the weight of corruption. The earth yielded without resistance. The heavens watched without interference. Nothing was hidden because nothing had yet gone astray. Time itself felt different in this age. It moved slowly, not because it was empty, but because it was full. Each moment carried weight. Each act echoed softly through creation. There was no rush toward completion because completion was already held within the design. This was the sacred framework of the beginning, a world held together not by force but by trust, not by chaos restrained but by order embraced. And beneath all of it stood a truth often forgotten in later ages. Nothing existed without permission. Nothing unfolded outside of allowance. Even in perfection, all things moved within boundaries that were set with wisdom. What would later be broken was first carefully formed. The authority that would one day be challenged was first established in peace. The obedience that would later be abandoned was once the natural posture of all beings. In this beginning, there was no rebellion, no division, no shadow crossing between heaven and earth. Only design, only alignment, only order, resting quietly in its appointed place. Within this ordered beginning, purpose moved quietly through every layer of creation. Nothing existed without meaning. Nothing acted without assignment. The heavens did not drift. The earth did not wander. Each realm reflected the wisdom that had spoken it into being. Angels in this age were not distant forms of light. They were present, aware, and attentive. Their role was not to reshape creation but to serve it. They stood as stewards of divine instruction, ensuring that what had been set in motion remained undisturbed. Their awareness was vast, yet their freedom was defined. Restraint was their strength. They understood that authority was not seized but received. That power was safest when it remained aligned with command. They did not ask why limits existed. They understood that limits preserved life. Boundaries were not barriers. They were protections placed with intention. Some angels were entrusted with observation alone. They watched the unfolding of the world, recording its patterns and changes. Others were sent to guide movements, to carry messages, to preserve balance between realms. None acted independently. None spoke without instruction. Their unity came not from sameness, but from obedience to a single will. This order created stillness. Harmony was not maintained through constant correction, but through faithful continuity. When each being remained where it was placed, nothing strained against itself. Heaven did not press into the earth. Earth did not rise toward the heavens. The space between them was not empty, but purposeful. It was within this space that humanity began its early path. Humanity, newly formed, carried no ambition toward dominance. The breath of life within them had not yet been burdened by fear or hunger for power. Their days unfolded simply. They labored without despair. They rested without guilt. The earth responded to their care, yielding what was needed in its proper season. Above them the heavens remained watchful, not intrusive. Angels did not interfere with the human will. They did not guide every step or correct every choice. Observation was their task, not control. Humanity was allowed to grow, to learn, to move freely within the design that had been prepared. This balance was deliberate. Freedom existed, but it was framed by truth. Knowledge existed, but it was given in stages. The unfolding of understanding was meant to be slow, matched to maturity. Nothing was meant to be taken before its time. Hierarchy served this unfolding. The Most High remained the source of all authority. Beneath him, the heavenly order functioned as a living structure, stable and unbroken. Beneath that, the earth and its inhabitants moved within the shelter of this design. Each level depended upon the faithfulness of the one above it. When obedience was kept, harmony followed. This is why later transgression would carry such weight. The design was not fragile. It was generous. It allowed freedom, growth, and time, but it required trust, and trust, once broken, reshaped everything beneath it. In this early age, nothing yet strained against that trust. There was no urgency in heaven, no alarm among the angels, no sorrow rising from the earth. All things remained aligned because all things remained within their appointed roles. This alignment was not maintained by silence but by understanding. Angels knew what they were. Humanity knew what it was. Neither sought to become what they were not. The heavens did not envy the earth. The earth did not reach for the heavens. Such clarity allowed peace to endure. This was the foundation upon which all later history would stand. A world built upon order before it would learn disorder. A harmony established before it would be tested. Authority explained before it would be challenged. Nothing was missing. Nothing was withheld unjustly. Nothing unfolded without reason. The stillness of this age was not emptiness. It was fullness held in balance. And within that balance, all creation waited, unaware that division would one day enter, where harmony had once been complete. In this first age, authority rested without tension. It was neither questioned nor enforced through struggle. It existed as a natural truth, like breath within the body or light within the heavens. All beings recognized it, not because they were compelled, but because it was woven into their understanding. The Most High did not rule through distance. His will was present in every structure he established. Law was not separate from life. Command was not separate from care. What was spoken carried wisdom, and what was commanded carried protection. Authority was never arbitrary. It was measured, purposeful, and complete. Angels understood this deeply. They did not see obedience as loss. They understood it as alignment with their own design. To remain within command was to remain whole. To act outside of it was unthinkable, not because it was forbidden alone, but because it would undo the harmony that sustained all things. This understanding preserved peace. The heavens did not compete for influence. The earth did not suffer beneath unseen struggles. There was no disorder hidden behind beauty. What was visible reflected what was true. Creation did not groan because it was not yet burdened. The soil was not stained. The air was not heavy. Silence itself was unbroken. This was a world untouched by corruption. Time in this age carried no urgency. It was not counted by decay or loss. It moved with patience, allowing each purpose to unfold fully. Generations passed without fear of ending. Memory was long. Awareness was steady. Nothing rushed toward dominance or completion. Within this stillness, every action carried consequence, yet none carried weight of guilt. The foundations of authority were firm because they were understood. Angels did not confuse their proximity to humanity with permission to alter it. Humanity did not mistake freedom for ownership. The earth was not possessed but tended. The heavens were not entered but honored. Boundaries remained intact because they were respected. This respect did not arise from ignorance. It arose from clarity. Each being knew its origin. Each knew its limit. Each knew the source from which all life flowed. There was no desire to ascend beyond assignment because nothing felt lacking within it. Later ages would forget this. They would speak of power as something seized rather than entrusted, knowledge as something taken rather than revealed, authority as something contested rather than received. But in the beginning, none of these distortions existed. This is why the earliest design carried such weight. When division would later come, it would not be the failure of creation but the rejection of its order. What would be broken was not fragile. It was first whole. What would fall was not ignorant. It once understood clearly. Nothing in this age unfolded by chance. Every role was permitted, every movement allowed, every limit intentional. Even the freedom to choose was held within divine allowance. The Most High did not create disorder, yet he allowed the possibility of departure from order. This allowance was not weakness, it was patience. Creation was not forced into loyalty, it was invited into it. This truth rests at the heart of all that followed. The severe weight of later transgression can only be understood by seeing how complete the original alignment was. The sorrow of judgment can only be understood by remembering the peace that preceded it. In the earliest age, heaven and earth stood in quiet agreement. They were separate yet responsive, distinct yet harmonious. No veil divided them, no conflict strained between them. Only trust held them together. And that trust was not blind, it was rooted in design, it was sustained by obedience, it was preserved by restraint. When division would later enter, it would do so against this foundation, not as correction but as consequence, not as accident but as response. For now, in this beginning, all things remained where they were placed. Authority stood unchallenged. Order stood undisturbed. Heaven and earth moved as they were intended. And within this sacred stillness, the first chapter of history rested, complete and whole, awaiting the turning that had not yet come. Among the hosts of heaven, there existed a distinct order whose task was neither rule nor worship alone. They were appointed to watch. Their role was observation, presence, and record. They were known in ancient writings as the Watchers. These beings were not newly formed when humanity appeared. They carried memory older than generations. Time did not weigh upon them as it did upon the earth. Their awareness extended across ages, and their understanding grew through long attention rather than change. They were patient by nature, steady in purpose, and formed for endurance. The Book of Enoch speaks of their station with quiet precision. They were set apart, not above all others, but positioned with intention. Their authority was limited. Their knowledge was vast, yet bound. They were entrusted with insight, but forbidden from ownership. They were permitted to see, but not to take part. This boundary defined their holiness. The Watchers were assigned to observe humanity as it unfolded across the earth. They measured the passing of generations. They watched the growth of families, the shaping of cultures, the slow forming of human will. They did not govern these developments. They were not sent to rule or to teach beyond what was commanded. Their task was to witness and to preserve what had been ordered. They stood between heaven and earth, not as bridges but as sentinels. Their presence was not constant in form. At times they remained unseen. At times they were known only through influence and restraint. Their awareness of humanity was detailed, yet their distance was required. Nearness was allowed, union was not. This distinction was essential. The Watchers understood that knowledge carried weight. What they knew was not meant to be shared freely. Some knowledge belonged to heaven alone. Some truths, if revealed too early, would fracture rather than guide. Wisdom required timing, and timing required obedience. They were never meant to alter human destiny. They were never meant to reshape flesh, authority, or inheritance. They were never meant to replace divine instruction with their own insight. Their role was to remain aligned with heaven while watching the earth from within its bounds. Yet this assignment carried risk. To watch closely is to become familiar. To observe continually is to grow accustomed. Over long ages, attention can soften into attachment. Distance, once maintained by clarity, can begin to feel unnecessary. Boundaries, once honored, can begin to appear negotiable. This danger did not arrive suddenly. There was no immediate rebellion among the watchers, no uprising, no declaration against heaven. The erosion was quiet. It began with extended stillness, with prolonged observation, with fascination unchallenged by withdrawal. They watched humanity live, struggle, grow, and choose. They saw emotion take form. They saw beauty shaped by time. They saw fragility and strength woven together. Over long ages, attention lingered. The watchers were not ignorant of command. They did not forget their station, but stillness can weaken vigilance. Silence can blur urgency. What was once observed with restraint began to be regarded with interest. This was the first turning. It did not yet break obedience, but it shifted focus. Attention moved downward more than upward. Observation became absorption. The weight of heaven felt distant, while the immediacy of the earth grew stronger. The watchers remained at their posts, yet their inward alignment began to drift. This chapter of history does not describe evil born in violence. It describes obedience softened by familiarity, restraint thinned by time, silence that went unchallenged. They were still watchers. They were still appointed. But their gaze lingered longer than it should have. The seeds of transgression were planted not in action, but in attention, not in rebellion, but in fascination, not in noise, but in quiet allowance. From this stillness, change would one day emerge. But for now, the watchers remained where they were placed, unaware that prolonged watching, unguarded, was already shaping the path ahead. The watchers had been given much, but not without measure. Their wisdom was real, yet it was bounded. Their insight reached far, yet it was restrained by command. They knew the structure of creation, the patterns written into the heavens and the laws that sustained the earth. But they did not know all things, nor were they meant to. Their knowledge was entrusted, not possessed. Ancient writings describe them as teachers of order, not instructors of humanity. What they understood was to be preserved, not distributed. What they carried was to remain aligned with the will that gave it. This distinction guarded both heaven and earth from imbalance. Yet prolonged nearness tests even the most disciplined restraint. As generations of humanity multiplied, the watchers observed change. Language grew, memory deepened, desire formed, human thought became more complex, more expressive. Emotion took clearer shape. Attachment appeared not only among humans, but as something seen, studied, and contemplated by those who watched. Observation began to feel participatory. What had once been measured from a distance began to feel present. The watchers did not act, but they remained. They did not intervene, but they lingered. Heaven remained their origin, yet earth occupied their attention more fully with each passing age. Still, no command was broken. This is how erosion begins, not through defiance but through delay, not through refusal but through hesitation to withdraw. The watchers did not question heaven openly. They did not speak against their purpose. They simply remained where fascination had taken hold. The Book of Enoch speaks quietly of this change. It does not describe anger but descent of attention. It does not speak first of action, but of watching that became prolonged beyond wisdom. Their station remained the same, but their inward posture shifted. Restraint weakened not because it was rejected, but because it was no longer actively guarded. Knowledge, once held with reverence, began to feel incomplete without expression. Insight, once sufficient in silence, began to seek form. The Watchers knew what humanity did not. They saw what humans could not see. Over time, this difference created tension. They were aware of boundaries. They were aware of consequence. But awareness alone does not preserve obedience. Proximity creates familiarity. Familiarity reduces awe. Awe is the guardian of restraint. When awe fades, permission can be imagined where none was given. The Watchers were never commanded to withdraw entirely from the earth. Their assignment required presence, but presence demanded discipline. Discipline required constant alignment with heaven. When that alignment weakened, presence became dangerous. Still, heaven did not intervene. Silence continued. Command remained unchanged. The Watchers were not removed. They were not corrected. Time passed without interruption. This silence was not approval but patience. Yet patience, misunderstood, can feel like allowance. Within this quiet, the Watchers began to look more often toward the earth than toward heaven. This turning was subtle. It left no mark at first. There were no visible signs of corruption, no disruption of order. But inwardly, attention had shifted from obedience to curiosity. Curiosity alone is not rebellion. But curiosity unattended can become desire. This chapter of history reveals a truth often overlooked. Disobedience rarely begins with action. It begins with stillness unexamined, with silence that no longer listens upward, with fascination allowed to deepen without restraint. The Watchers remained wise. They remained ancient. They remained appointed. But wisdom without vigilance drifts. Age without humility weakens. Appointment without obedience loses its anchor. The foundations of transgression were not laid in a moment. They were laid slowly, over ages of watching, waiting, and lingering. By the time attention fully turned away from heaven, the path had already been shaped. And though no boundary had yet been crossed, the distance between command and desire had quietly narrowed. In the long stillness of their assignment, the Watchers stood at a quiet threshold. They had not yet acted, yet they were no longer unchanged. What they were meant to remain had begun to blur, not through force, but through familiarity. Their station was clear, but their attention was divided. They continued to observe humanity with care and precision. They still recorded the passing of generations. They still understood the boundaries set before them. Yet the weight of heaven no longer rested as heavily upon their awareness. The earth had become nearer in thought than the throne above. This shift did not feel like disobedience. There was no sense of betrayal in its earliest form. There was only fascination left unchallenged. Prolonged watching had shaped perception. What was once observed as part of divine design began to be regarded through personal interest. The Watchers did not forget heaven, but they did not look toward it as often. This is how restraint thins, not when command is denied, but when alignment is no longer refreshed. Obedience requires remembrance. It requires turning the gaze upward again and again. When this turning slows, distance forms. The Watchers began to contemplate what they saw rather than why they were watching. They observed human beauty, human creativity, human longing. They saw strength forming within frailty. They saw desire expressed without full understanding. These observations were not sinful in themselves, but contemplation without restraint reshapes intention. Knowledge, when held too closely to desire, becomes unstable. The Book of Enoch does not portray the Watchers as ignorant or impulsive. It presents them as beings who knew the consequences of transgression. This knowledge did not prevent the drift, it only delayed action. Awareness alone is not obedience. it must be paired with humility. Silence continued to surround them. Heaven did not intervene to correct their inward turning. The watchers were not recalled. Their station remained unchanged. This silence was not abandonment. It was allowance. Freedom remained intact, even for those appointed to watch. This freedom carried weight. Within it, choice still existed. The watchers were not compelled toward transgression. They moved toward it slowly, through unattended attention and unguarded stillness. What was once unthinkable began to feel possible, then distant, then quiet. Desire did not appear suddenly. It emerged from familiarity, from time unmarked by renewal. They remained at their posts, yet their inward posture was no longer anchored fully in obedience. The distinction between watching and participating began to soften. The distance that once protected both heaven and earth grew thin. This was the moment before the fall. No oath had been spoken. No boundary crossed. No dissent taken. Yet the direction of the heart had shifted. This chapter of the Watcher's story teaches a solemn truth. The greatest departures often begin without movement. They begin in stillness that no longer listens, in fascination that no longer withdraws, in silence that no longer waits for command. The Watchers were never meant to become rulers of the earth. They were never meant to teach forbidden knowledge. They were never meant to cross into flesh or inheritance. These outcomes were not part of their design. But design requires guarding. Without vigilance, even appointed roles can be forgotten. Without remembrance, even ancient beings can drift. Without obedience renewed, even wisdom can become a pathway toward transgression. At the end of this age of watching, nothing outward had yet changed. Heaven still stood. Earth still turned. Humanity continued unaware of what stirred above. Yet within the Watchers, a quiet distance had formed. The gaze that once rested firmly on heaven now lingered longer upon the earth. And in that lingering, the appointed station of the Watchers stood on the edge of its undoing. The fall had not yet begun, but the path toward it had already been prepared. The turning that had begun in silence now sought form. What had lingered in thought moved slowly toward action. The Watchers, long stationed between heaven and earth, reached a moment where attention alone was no longer enough. The inward drift demanded outward expression. This moment did not arrive in haste. It gathered over time, shaped by shared contemplation and unspoken agreement. The Watchers were not isolated from one another. They knew each other's thoughts without words. Awareness passed among them quietly. What one considered, another recognized. What one hesitated to name, another had already weighed. From this shared stillness, resolve formed. Ancient tradition speaks of their descent upon a mountain later known as Hermon. Its name carried meaning, bound to devotion and binding. It stood as a high place, neither heaven nor low earth, but a threshold between realms. The Watchers did not descend scattered. They came together. Unity marked the moment. This was not a sudden rebellion led by one voice. It was a collective decision, formed through shared agreement. Each Watcher knew the boundary that stood before them. Each knew the command that had shaped their station. And yet together, they chose to move beyond it. The descent itself was measured. They did not fall. They stepped downward with intention. Their movement was not chaotic. It was deliberate, heavy with awareness. Each step carried consequence already understood. This was not ignorance breaking obedience. It was knowledge turning away from command. Upon the mountain, they bound themselves with an oath. In ancient understanding, an oath was not mere speech. It was an act that shaped reality. Words spoken in unity carried weight beyond intention. To swear together was to seal the will, to fix the path forward. Among eternal beings, an oath carried irreversible force. The Watchers understood this. They did not swear lightly. They spoke knowing that words, once bound, could not be withdrawn. The oath was not taken to persuade one another, but to prevent retreat. It was a mutual sealing, ensuring that none would turn back when consequence became clear. By binding themselves together, they removed the possibility of repentance through separation. This was the true depth of the rebellion. Not only did they choose disobedience, but they chose unity within it. They made themselves accountable to one another rather than to heaven. The oath replaced obedience. Loyalty shifted from command to collective resolve. In this moment, the course became sealed. The gravity of the oath reshaped their existence. What had been permitted observation became forbidden participation. What had been restraint gave way to intention. The descent was no longer symbolic. It was real, and it was final. Above them, heaven remained silent. No voice thundered. No command intervened. The Watchers were not struck down as they spoke. The oath was allowed to stand. This silence was not ignorance. It was patience. Judgment was not absent. It was delayed. Divine response, when it comes, is measured. The silence of heaven in this moment carries weight equal to any spoken word. It reveals a truth woven throughout sacred history. Choice is permitted fully before consequence arrives. Freedom is not revoked at the moment of transgression. It is allowed to complete its course. The Watchers finished their oath knowing this. They stood together upon the mountain, bound not by chains but by word. Their descent had begun not with motion but with agreement. Their rebellion had taken form not through chaos but through unity. From this moment forward, return would not be simple. The path back had narrowed. The design they had once served now stood behind them. The descent marked more than movement from heaven toward earth. It marked the beginning of irreversible change. After the oath was spoken, stillness followed. The mountain bore witness, silent and unmoving. The Watchers remained together, aware that what had been sealed could not be undone. The words they had spoken did not fade into the air. They settled, heavy and enduring. An oath among eternal beings reshapes time itself. For mortals, vows may be forgotten or broken. For those formed beyond time, words bind essence. What was sworn on the mountain did not merely promise action. It altered alignment. The Watchers no longer stood within the flow of command as before. Their unity had redefined their place. They had chosen one another over heaven. This unity was their strength and their burden. None stood apart. None claimed innocence. Each bore equal weight in the decision. The oath ensured that fear would not scatter them, that consequence would not isolate them. It was a bond formed not for righteousness, but for resolve. Ancient understanding held that oaths call witnesses unseen. Heaven hears what is sworn. Earth receives its effect. The Watchers knew that what had been spoken would echo beyond the mountain. They knew that judgment end would come, but not yet. Silence still surrounded them. The absence of immediate response from heaven was not relief. It was solemn allowance. Divine patience does not rush to interrupt choice. It allows intent to reveal itself fully. In this patience, responsibility deepens. The Watchers remained aware of heaven's authority, yet they had stepped outside its protection. This was the cost of the oath. By binding themselves together, they had removed the last barrier to descent. Individual restraint had been replaced by collective commitment. Doubt could no longer interrupt action. Reflection could no longer reverse direction. What remained was movement forward. The mountain marked a threshold crossed. From that place, the Watchers no longer merely observed the earth. They had committed to participation. The boundary that once defined their holiness now stood behind them. Their knowledge, once held in trust, would soon seek expression. Yet even now, judgment waited. This waiting reveals a truth that echoes throughout sacred history. Divine justice is not impulsive. It does not strike at the first sign of defiance. It allows rebellion to reveal its full nature. Only then does judgment speak with clarity. The Watchers were given this space. Heaven did not silence them mid-oath. It did not prevent their unity. This was not weakness. It was measured authority. The Most High allows choice to stand so that consequence may be just. In this moment, the Watchers stood between what they had been and what they would become. They were no longer aligned as before, yet they had not yet acted beyond the oath. This in-between state carried weight. The future pressed forward, while the past receded quietly. The descent, though begun, had not yet completed its full course. But the oath ensured that it would. The mountain of Hermon remained behind them as a witness, its name bound forever to devotion turned away. What had been spoken there could not be recalled. The path ahead was set, not by accident, but by choice sealed in unity. The silence of heaven continued. It was not indifference. It was patience heavy with consequence. Judgment would come in its time, neither early nor late. For now, the Watchers were allowed to walk the path they had chosen. The irreversible change had begun, not with destruction, but with commitment. From this moment onward, the Watchers no longer stood merely as observers of history. They had stepped into it. With the oath sealed, the weight of the decision settled fully upon the Watchers. What had been chosen together now rested upon each one without division. There was no return to solitude, no quiet retreat into individual obedience. The bond they had formed held them in shared consequence. This was the final gravity of their choice. The oath did not merely unite them in intent. It altered the direction of their existence. From this moment, their identity as Watchers began to dissolve. They remained ancient, powerful, and aware, yet their alignment had shifted. They no longer stood fully within their appointed station. They had stepped beyond it. The descent, though physical in appearance, was spiritual in depth. By choosing to move as one, they crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed. The order of heaven did not shatter in response, but it no longer held them as before. They stood outside the shelter of command. Still, heaven remained patient. This silence must not be mistaken for absence. It was restraint. The Most High did not rush to undo what had been freely chosen. Judgment, when it comes, carries clarity because it waits until choice is complete. The Watchers understood this truth. They knew that the delay of response did not erase consequence. It deepened it. Time, once a gentle unfolding, now carried weight. Each moment after the oath pressed them further from what they had been. The unity they had chosen now demanded continuation. To break from the oath would fracture them. To withdraw would isolate them from one another. The bond that had seemed to provide courage now removed escape. They were bound not by force, but by word, and word among eternal beings shapes reality. This is why the descent marked irreversible change. Disobedience alone might have allowed return. Unity in disobedience sealed the path. By standing together against command, they bound themselves to the outcome together. No single Watcher could claim lesser guilt or separate fate. The mountain had borne witness. The oath had been spoken. The silence of heaven had allowed it to stand. What followed would unfold according to justice, not impulse. In sacred history, this moment stands as a warning written quietly. Rebellion does not always begin with noise or violence. It begins with agreement, with shared resolve against restraint, with unity placed above obedience. The Watchers had not yet taught forbidden knowledge. They had not yet crossed into flesh. They had not yet altered the course of humanity. Why? The fall had already begun. Their descent was no longer merely toward the earth. It was away from alignment, away from permission, away from the station that had preserved them. This chapter closes not with destruction, but with stillness heavy with certainty. The watchers stood together, no longer able to turn back, moving forward under the weight of their own words. Heaven watched. Earth waited. The irreversible path lay open before them, shaped not by chaos, but by deliberate choice. And so the descent continued, sealed by oath, allowed by patience, and bound to consequence that would in time answer fully. What had been sealed by oath now moved into action. The watchers, no longer restrained by their appointed station, crossed a boundary never intended to be crossed. The separation between heaven and earth, once held firm by command, was breached through union. This union was not described in ancient texts with celebration or wonder. It is recorded with restraint, heavy with consequence. The watchers took human women, and from this crossing, new beings entered the world. They were neither wholly of heaven nor wholly of earth. They were called the Nephilim. Their birth was not sudden, nor singular. It unfolded across time, spreading quietly before its weight was fully known. These offspring carried strength beyond ordinary measure. Their bodies were formed with unusual might. Their minds held sharpness and awareness far exceeding those around them. Yet these traits were not gifts. They were distortions. The Nephilim did not emerge as children of balance. Their nature reflected a mixing never designed to occur. The harmony of creation depended upon separation of kind. Spirit and flesh were not meant to merge in this way. Authority and submission were not meant to be inherited through violation. The Nephilim embodied this rupture. Ancient traditions speak of their size and strength in varied ways. Some describe towering figures. Others speak of unmatched warriors and rulers. These accounts are not presented as spectacle, but as memory shaped by fear. They reflect how deeply the Nephilim marked the human world. What mattered was not their height alone, but their presence. They grew quickly in influence. Their strength allowed them to dominate. Their intelligence allowed them to command. Their origin granted them authority that felt unquestionable to those around them. Humanity, still young and vulnerable, could not resist them. The Nephilim became leaders. Not leaders appointed by wisdom or consent, but rulers by force and fear. They gathered power. They took what they desired. They taught humanity ways of violence, domination, and excess. Their rule was not stewardship. It was consumption. This was not evolution. It was corruption taking form. The knowledge they carried was not earned through patience. It was inherited through transgression. The watchers, once forbidden to teach beyond command, now imparted understanding without restraint through their offspring. Skills of war spread. Authority shifted toward power alone. Balance began to collapse. The earth, once yielding freely, began to groan under misuse. Resources were taken without care. Blood was spilled without pause. The Nephilim consumed more than they created. Their presence demanded constant tribute, constant submission. Violence increased. Humanity learned quickly from its new rulers. Fear replaced trust. Strength replaced cooperation. The simple rhythms of early life fractured under pressure. Communities were reshaped around survival rather than harmony. The Nephilim did not merely fight. They ruled, judged, and reshaped society according to their will. They were remembered not only as warriors, but as kings, builders, and teachers of forbidden ways. Their authority rested on dominance rather than alignment with divine order. This authority was false. It appeared powerful, but it lacked permission. It was enforced, not entrusted. It expanded rapidly because it fed on imbalance. The more the Nephilim ruled, the more the earth suffered. Creation itself began to bear the weight. The land no longer rested. The animals were hunted without measure. Humanity multiplied in violence. The cry of the earth grew louder, though it was not yet answered. The Nephilim stood as living symbols of corrupted authority. They showed what happens when power is divorced from obedience, when strength exists without restraint, when knowledge is given without wisdom. Their existence testified not to progress, but to distortion. The Watchers had sought expression. What emerged was devastation. The birth of the Nephilim marked a turning point that could not be ignored. Creation itself recognized the imbalance. What had once been held in harmony now strained under excess. The earth suffered, not because it was weak, but because what walked upon it was never meant to exist. As the Nephilim grew in number and stature, their presence reshaped the world around them. Their influence did not remain confined to strength alone. It spread into every structure of human life. What they touched did not remain as it was. They possessed awareness beyond ordinary understanding. This awareness did not lead to wisdom. It led to control. The Nephilim understood patterns of authority instinctively. They recognized fear. They recognized obedience born from force. They used these tools without hesitation. Human societies reorganized around them. Settlements that once gathered for mutual survival now gathered in submission. Labor became tribute. Strength became law. The Nephilim ruled not through unsell but through command. Their word carried finality, not because it was just, but because resistance brought destruction. Ancient memory preserved their reign as an age of heroes and giants. Yet this memory is shaped by terror, not admiration. Names were remembered because they inspired fear. Deeds were repeated because they scarred generations. Legends grew because the weight of their rule demanded explanation. The Nephilim did not merely conquer. They instructed. Through them, forbidden knowledge moved freely among humanity. Skills meant to remain undeveloped were forced into use. Weapons were refined. Warfare became systematic. The taking of life grew efficient. What was once rare became common. This knowledge did not elevate humanity. It burdened it. Human hands learned violence faster than restraint. Power became desirable. Authority was no longer measured by care, but by dominance. Those who imitated the Nephilim survived longer than those who resisted them. Excess followed. Consumption grew without limit. Resources were stripped rather than stewarded. Animals were hunted beyond need. Blood filled the soil. The rhythm of rest was broken. The earth no longer had time to recover. This was not accidental. The Nephilim demanded constant supply. Their size and strength required more than the earth could give. Their rule fed upon expansion. When one region was drained, another was taken. Boundaries were erased. The earth began to suffer visibly. Ancient texts speak of the land crying out. This is not poetry alone. It reflects a truth understood by early generations. Creation responds to misuse. When balance is broken, the ground itself bears witness. Humanity under this rule changed. Fear shaped behavior. Trust faded. The simple patterns of early life disappeared. Communities turned against one another. Survival required allegiance to power. Compassion weakened. Violence spread not only from the Nephilim but among humans themselves. Corruption multiplied. The Watchers, through their offspring, had altered the course of the world. What they had once guarded was now unrecognizable. The order they were meant to preserve had been overturned through their union. This outcome was not unforeseen. The distortion was the natural result of crossing sacred boundaries. Authority taken without permission does not stabilize. It expands until collapse. Knowledge released without restraint does not enlighten. It consumes. The Nephilim embodied this truth. They were not merely large in form. They were heavy in consequence. Their presence pressed down upon creation. The balance between heaven and earth strained under their weight. This strain did not remain hidden. Violence filled the days. Excess filled the nights. The quiet harmony of the early world vanished beneath domination. Humanity was no longer guided by trust in divine order, but by fear of corrupted power. The Nephilim ruled as symbols of what happens when design is violated. They were not monsters by appearance alone. They were distortions made visible, living evidence that strength without obedience becomes destruction. The earth continued to endure, but it did so under growing burden. And as the Nephilim's dominion spread, the cost of their existence became impossible to ignore. As the age of the Nephilim continued, the distortion they embodied deepened. Their rule did not settle into stability. It intensified. What began as domination grew into excess without boundary. Power, once seized, demanded constant expansion to sustain itself. The Nephilim did not rule in harmony with the land. They extracted without rest. They consumed without return. Their authority was measured by what they could take and hold. This approach spread among humanity, reshaping desire itself. Survival gave way to ambition. Ambition gave way to cruelty. The earth bore this weight in silence. Ancient memory preserves images of famine following abundance, of land stripped bare, of creatures hunted beyond measure. These are not tales of exaggeration. They reflect the cost of imbalance. When power forgets restraint, creation responds with scarcity. The Nephilim became symbols of corrupted order. They were remembered as mighty, yet their might was hollow. It did not build lasting peace. It did not preserve life. It did not align with divine intent. Their strength magnified destruction rather than healing. They were not guardians. They were rulers without permission. This distinction mattered. Authority rooted in design preserves. Authority taken through force erodes. The Nephilim represented the latter. Their existence revealed what happens when power is divorced from obedience. The Watchers, once appointed to preserve balance, now witnessed its collapse through their own actions. Though not described openly in ancient texts at this stage, their responsibility remained woven into the outcome. The distortion of the Nephilim reflected the breach that had birthed them. Creation responded. Violence reached every corner of the world. Bloodshed became common. Life was treated as expendable. The simple joy of early humanity vanished beneath fear and oppression. What had been formed in peace now groaned under corruption. This groaning did not go unheard. The earth itself began to cry out. Ancient writings speak of the land appealing to heaven. This image carries weight beyond metaphor. It reflects a spiritual truth. Creation is not passive. It bears witness to misuse and calls for correction. The Nephilim's presence accelerated this cry. Their size and strength required constant supply. Their rule demanded endless labor. Humanity bent beneath the burden. Those who resisted were destroyed. Those who complied lost themselves slowly. This was not an age of progress. It was an age of distortion exposed. The Nephilim were not an advancement of humanity. They were evidence of violation. Their existence did not elevate creation. It fractured it. What they embodied could not endure without consequence. Balance, once broken, seeks restoration. This chapter closes not with spectacle, but with recognition. The The Nephilim stood as living proof that crossing sacred boundaries produces suffering, not fulfillment. Their reign showed the cost of authority seized rather than entrusted. The earth suffered beneath them. Humanity suffered beneath them. Creation itself awaited response. The birth of the Nephilim had altered the world. What followed would not be immediate, but it would be certain. Divine order, patient though it is, does not remain silent forever. The distortion had been revealed. And the earth, heavy with the weight of what walked upon it, continued to cry out, awaiting the judgment that would one day answer fully. What the Nephilim embodied in strength, their fathers supplied in knowledge. The Watchers, having crossed their appointed boundary, no longer restrained what they carried. Wisdom once guarded in silence was released without measure. What had been entrusted for observation was now given for control. This transmission was deliberate. Ancient writings record that the Watchers revealed teachings never intended for the earth in that age. These were not simple skills. They were deep understandings of structure, force, and influence. Knowledge that shapes matter. Knowledge that bends will. Knowledge that accelerates domination. Humanity was unprepared. The arts of warfare were among the first to spread. Metal was shaped into instruments of destruction. Strategies were refined. Conflict became calculated rather than instinctive. Violence moved from impulse to system. Death was organized. This knowledge did not arrive slowly. It spread rapidly. Alongside warfare came manipulation of nature. The cycles of growth were forced rather than followed. The earth was pressed to yield beyond its limits. Seasons were disrupted. Balance was ignored. What had once been tended with patience was now exploited for gain. Sorcery followed. Not spectacle, but control through hidden means. Ancient texts speak of enchantments, signs, and altered perception. These practices did not seek harmony. They sought advantage. They taught humanity how to influence outcomes without submission to divine order. Power became the aim. The Nephilim stood as living proof of its effectiveness. Their authority validated the teachings. Humanity, watching their dominance, learned quickly that strength and knowledge combined could override restraint. Trust in divine provision weakened as trust in power grew. Cities formed around this knowledge. Settlements were no longer shaped for shared life, but for control. Hierarchies rose with the Nephilim at their peak. Beneath them stood those closest to forbidden teachings. Beneath them, the laboring masses. Society reorganized itself around dominance rather than stewardship. This was the beginning of empire. An empire not defined by borders alone, but by dependence on corrupted knowledge. Authority flowed from those who controlled the teachings. Obedience was enforced through fear and reward. Power replaced wisdom. Strength replaced care. Apocryphal lists describe specific teachings revealed by the Watchers. They speak of weapon-making, enchantment, astrology misused, and the reading of signs for control rather than guidance. These lists are not meant to impress. They serve as warnings. Wisdom without restraint destroys. Knowledge, when separated from obedience, accelerates corruption. Humanity was not lifted by these teachings. It was reshaped by them. Daily life changed. Work became labor without rest. Community became hierarchy. Survival depended on alignment with power. Trust in the divine faded quietly. Humanity no longer waited for provision. It seized control. It no longer listened upward. It listened to those who promised strength. The Nephilim Empire expanded not only through conquest but through imitation. Corruption moved outward. It did not remain with rulers alone. It entered households. It shaped customs. It altered values. What was once considered excessive became normal. What was once forbidden became admired. This chapter of history reveals how quickly imbalance spreads when knowledge is released without wisdom. The Watchers had opened a door. The Nephilim enforced what came through it. An empire rose, not built on care but on control. And the foundations of daily life shifted beneath the weight of forbidden knowledge, pressing creation further from its original design. As forbidden knowledge spread, its influence settled into the ordinary rhythms of life. What began among rulers and warriors did not remain distant from the people. It moved steadily into fields, homes, and marketplaces. The empire shaped by the Nephilim was sustained not only by fear, but by dependence. Humanity learned to rely on power. Skills once unnecessary became essential for survival. Tools of war were no longer held only by the mighty. They were distributed, copied, and refined. Violence became familiar. Children grew under its shadow. The sound of conflict no longer startled the earth as it once had. The manipulation of nature deepened. Crops were forced beyond their season. Land was drained rather than rested. The knowledge taught by the Watchers offered immediate gain but demanded long-term cost. The soil weakened. Yield diminished. Humanity responded not with restraint but with greater force. Sorcery shaped perception. It altered how people understood cause and outcome. Rather than seeking alignment with divine order, humanity sought control through signs and hidden practices. Outcomes were pursued without regard for consequence. The unseen was used, not revered. This knowledge created hierarchy. Those who understood the forbidden teachings rose in influence. Those who did not became dependent. Society divided sharply. Authority was no longer rooted in wisdom or service. It rested with those who held power over life and death. The Nephilim presided over this structure. They stood as living symbols of what knowledge could produce when freed from restraint. Their presence justified the empire's foundation. Their strength made resistance futile. Their intelligence made deception effective. Human trust shifted completely. Where once there had been patience, now there was urgency. Where there had been faith, now there was strategy. Where there had been humility, now there was ambition. Humanity no longer waited. It took. This shift altered daily existence. Work became relentless. Rest was seen as weakness. Compassion was dismissed as inefficiency. Life was valued according to usefulness. Those who could not contribute were discarded. The empire thrived outwardly. Cities grew, structures rose, systems hardened. From a distance it appeared powerful and advanced. Yet beneath this growth something essential was missing. Balance had been abandoned. The divine order was no longer consulted. The apocryphal warnings speak clearly here. They do not condemn knowledge itself. They condemn knowledge separated from obedience. Wisdom, when untethered from restraint, becomes a tool of domination. The Watchers' teachings, once meant to preserve understanding, now accelerated destruction. Corruption expanded quietly. It did not require constant enforcement. It became accepted. People adapted. They shaped their lives around power because nothing else seemed to protect them. The empire did not need to convince. It only needed to continue. This is how distortion sustains itself. The Nephilim did not rule alone. Humanity supported the system because it promised survival. Fear and dependence bound the people more tightly than chains. Daily life reflected this dependence in every choice made. The earth continued to suffer. The land bore scars. The air grew heavy. The rhythms of creation faltered. Yet the empire pressed on, convinced of its strength. Those in power saw no reason to change. This chapter reveals a slow truth. Corruption does not spread through spectacle alone. It spreads through usefulness. When forbidden knowledge appears to offer control, it replaces trust quietly and completely. The empire raised on such knowledge stood firm for a time, but its foundation was unstable. As the empire solidified, its reach extended beyond borders and generations. What the Nephilim and the Watchers had set in motion no longer required their constant direction. The system sustained itself. Forbidden knowledge had become the foundation of order. This was its greatest danger. When corruption becomes ordinary, it no longer appears corrupt. It becomes tradition. Children were born into the empire knowing nothing else. Power shaped their understanding of right and wrong. Strength defined worth. Control defined safety. The teachings of the Watchers remained at the center. They continued to reveal knowledge not openly to all but selectively. What was taught was measured to preserve dominance. Wisdom became currency. Access was reward. Ignorance ensured obedience. This knowledge shaped identity. People no longer saw themselves as stewards of creation. They saw themselves as masters of it. The earth was viewed as resource alone. Life was valued according to function. Compassion weakened as efficiency ruled. The Nephilim enforced this worldview. Their presence was constant. They did not need to appear often. Their reputation was enough. Authority flowed downward from them, shaping every layer of society. Those closest to them imitated their ways. Those beneath endured them. This empire did not seek harmony. It sought permanence through dominance. But dominance requires constant expansion. When growth slowed, pressure increased. Violence rose. Excess grew. The systems meant to preserve order intensified suffering. The apocryphal records warn of this pattern. They show that forbidden knowledge, when normalized, consumes those who rely on it. The Watchers' teachings did not bring stability. They accelerated collapse. Humanity became bound to power it could not control. Daily life reflected this burden. Work consumed time. Fear shaped choices. Rest was rare. Trust in the divine had nearly vanished. Humanity looked upward no longer. It looked toward rulers for survival. This is the true cost of forbidden knowledge. It replaces dependence on divine order with dependence on corrupted authority. It reshapes values until destruction feels necessary. It spreads until nothing remains untouched. The earth, enduring this empire, continued to cry out. Its response was not immediate. Creation is patient, but it is not silent forever. The imbalance had grown too great. The weight of corruption pressed deeply into every living thing. This chapter closes with recognition. An empire built on forbidden knowledge cannot sustain life. It may rise quickly. It may appear strong. But its foundation is distortion. What was never permitted cannot endure. The Nephilim and their Watcher fathers had reshaped the world. What followed would not be sudden. But the consequences of such knowledge, once released, moved steadily toward judgment. The empire stood tall. Yet beneath its strength, the ground itself waited for correction. As the age of violence deepened, creation itself began to respond. The suffering of the world did not remain hidden within human memory alone. It pressed outward, shaping the land, the air, and the rhythm of life. Ancient scripture speaks of the earth crying out, not as poetry, but as witness. The ground had absorbed too much blood. From the earliest days, the earth had received life gently. It yielded food. It supported growth. It bore the footsteps of humanity without resistance. But under the rule of the Nephilim, the land was no longer treated as sacred. It was stripped, wounded, and forced beyond its design. Violence saturated every region. Bloodshed was no longer isolated. It was constant. Conflict became ordinary. Life was taken without pause. The earth, formed to sustain life, now bore the weight of death without rest. This burden reached heaven. Ancient texts describe creation as responsive, not silent. When order is violated deeply enough, the created world testifies. The cry of the earth rose not in sound, but in consequence. Scarcity followed abundance. The land weakened. The harmony once present vanished. This cry did not accuse. It appealed. The suffering of creation reached the throne of the Most High, not as surprise, but as fulfillment of what had been permitted to unfold. The corruption had revealed itself fully. The distortion introduced through the Watchers and their offspring now stood exposed. Divine response followed. Judgment was decreed, not in haste, but with clarity. The Watchers who had abandoned their appointed stations were named. Their transgression was not overlooked. Their unity in rebellion had sealed their fate. The Nephilim, born of forbidden union, were marked for removal. Yet judgment was not executed immediately. This delay reveals the nature of divine justice. Judgment is not reaction. It is resolution. It waits until truth is fully visible. It allows consequence to ripen. Only then does correction come with precision. Angels were dispatched, not to destroy at once, but to deliver decree. Messengers moved between heaven and earth, carrying judgment already determined. Enforcers were appointed, not driven by wrath, but by obedience. The fate of the Watchers was sealed. Their future was fixed, though not yet realized. Binding, separation, and confinement were declared. Their authority was removed. Their freedom was ended. What remained was time before fulfillment. This chapter opens the moment when heaven answered the cry of creation. Not with chaos, not with haste, but with solemn judgment measured carefully across time. The decree spoken in heaven did not echo as thunder upon the earth. It moved quietly, carried by those appointed to enforce it. Divine judgment, when issued, does not seek spectacle. It seeks restoration through order. The angels sent forth were not emissaries of chaos. They were messengers of certainty. Each carried a role defined with precision. Some were sent to announce judgment. Others were assigned to restrain. Others still were prepared to execute what had been determined, though not yet. This order reflected the nature of divine justice. The Watchers were confronted not with confusion but with clarity. Their transgression was named fully. They were not accused of ignorance. They were judged according to knowledge they already possessed. Their oath, their dissent, and their corruption of creation were known. There was no defense to offer. Ancient writings describe this moment as one of recognition. The Watchers understood that what had been allowed was now concluded. Divine patience had reached its appointed end. The silence that once surrounded their rebellion was replaced by decree. Yet still, judgment waited. This delay was not mercy extended indefinitely. It was structure. Judgment unfolds according to design, not impulse. The consequences determined were irreversible, but their execution followed divine timing. The Nephilim were not struck down immediately. Their removal would come, but not yet. Their existence, though condemned, continued for a season. This allowance served purpose. It allowed the full weight of corruption to be seen. It allowed humanity's condition to be revealed without excuse. Justice requires clarity. The Watchers' fate, however, was fixed. They would be bound. Their influence would end. Their access to the earth would be removed. The authority they had seized would be stripped away. Angels were assigned to oversee this outcome. These were not new creations. They were ancient, steadfast, unmoved by fascination or delay. Their obedience contrasted sharply with the fall of the Watchers. They carried out their assignments without hesitation. This contrast revealed a deeper truth. Divine order had never collapsed, only certain beings had departed from it. Heaven remained intact, authority remained clear, judgment emerged not as repair, but as enforcement of what had always been true. The earth continued to cry out in this time. Violence had not ceased, corruption had not withdrawn. Humanity remained bound within the empire of forbidden knowledge. This suffering was not ignored, it was measured. Divine justice does not rush to silence suffering before its cause is fully addressed. The delay also revealed the weight of consequence. The Watchers had altered creation in ways that could not be undone instantly. Restoration would require removal, cleansing, and renewal. This process could not be hurried. The decree against the Watchers was absolute. They would not return to their former station. Their role as Watchers was ended. Their names would become warnings. Their legacy would not be erased but remembered as testimony. This part of the story reveals a solemn truth. Judgment does not arrive because heaven loses patience. It arrives because justice has completed its measure. When correction comes, it is precise, final, and purposeful. The earth waited. Heaven watched. The decree stood unchanging, moving steadily toward fulfillment. As time continued under the weight of decree, the nature of divine judgment became clearer. It was not distant, nor was it uncertain. It moved forward with calm inevitability. What had been spoken in heaven did not fade. It remained steady and unaltered. The delay itself carried meaning. It revealed that judgment was not born from anger but from order. The Most High does not correct creation in haste. He allows each act to reach its fullness, so that consequence stands beyond dispute. In this way, justice is shown to be complete. The Watchers were aware of this truth. They understood that the decree against them would not be reversed. Their binding was certain. Their removal from the earth was determined. Though time remained before execution, their future no longer belonged to them. This awareness carried weight. What had once felt like freedom now revealed itself as loss. Their knowledge, once vast, could not alter the decree. Their unity, once a source of resolve, could not shield them. Judgment had passed beyond debate. Angels appointed for enforcement stood ready. They did not act without instruction. They waited, unwavering. Their stillness reflected obedience untouched by fascination. In them, the contrast between faithfulness and rebellion was made clear. The Nephilim continued for a season. Their presence, though condemned, remained part of the unfolding consequence. Humanity still lived beneath their rule. Violence still marked the land. This was not neglect. It was revelation. The full cost of corruption was being displayed before its removal. Creation continued to bear witness. The earth's cry did not grow louder, but it grew deeper. Scarcity increased. Harmony diminished further. What once sustained life now struggled under excess. These signs were not random. They were testimony. Divine judgment does not erase evidence. It allows the truth of transgression to stand exposed. When correction finally arrives, it does so upon a record made clear. This chapter closes with the understanding that judgment had already begun, even before execution. The decree itself altered the course of history. What followed would unfold according to justice already set in motion. The earth waited for cleansing. The Watchers waited for binding. Humanity stood within the consequence of corrupted authority. Heaven remained patient, not because it was uncertain, but because its judgment was complete. Nothing spoken would be withdrawn. Nothing decreed would fail. The cry of the earth had been heard, and the response of heaven moved forward, steady and sure, toward the moment when correction would fully answer corruption. As judgment stood decreed yet delayed, the world entered its final season beneath the shadow of corruption. The Nephilim still ruled. The empire built on forbidden knowledge remained intact. Violence continued, not as chaos but as routine. Humanity lived within it, shaped by its weight. It was in these days that warnings were given. They did not arrive as thunder. They came quietly, carried by voices set apart. Among them stood Enoch, whose life moved differently from the generations around him. Ancient texts describe him as one who walked in alignment, whose attention remained fixed upward while the world below decayed. Enoch's message was not loud. It did not rely on fear or spectacle. It spoke of order, of consequence, of judgment already determined. He spoke of the watcher's fate, of binding and separation, of justice that would not be avoided. His words carried clarity rather than urgency. They were largely ignored. Humanity heard but did not turn. The world had grown accustomed to power. The presence of the Nephilim had reshaped expectation. Strength was admired. Control was trusted. Comfort, though built on corruption, felt secure. Enoch's warnings unsettled this security. They asked for restraint where excess ruled. They called for trust where power dominated. Such messages found little place in an age shaped by fear and ambition. Those who benefited from the empire saw no reason to change. Those who suffered under it saw no path beyond it. Time passed. Enoch remained faithful, bearing the weight of truth without witness. His warnings did not soften. They did not adapt to please. They remained steady, rooted in divine order rather than human approval. Later, another voice emerged. Noah lived among a generation described as corrupted in every way. Violence surrounded daily life. Excess filled the land. Trust in divine order had nearly vanished. Yet Noah's path did not follow the pattern around him. He was marked not by strength, but by obedience. Noah's warning was not spoken through crowds alone. It was lived. His actions testified quietly against the world's direction. He labored in patience, guided by instruction unseen by others. His obedience stood as a living contradiction to the empire of power. Still, humanity did not turn. The warnings were clear. They were persistent. They were given over time, not in haste. Yet hearts remained unchanged. This failure was not rooted in ignorance. Knowledge had filled the world. Understanding had increased. What was lacking was willingness. Humanity had accepted corruption. Power provided protection. Excess provided comfort. The empire, though violent, felt stable. Turning away from it required loss. It required trust in something unseen. Few were willing to release what felt secure, even as it destroyed them. This acceptance deepened sorrow. Those who remained faithful carried a quiet burden. They watched corruption expand while truth was dismissed. They spoke without response. They labored without recognition. Their faithfulness did not produce visible change. Yet it endured. The warnings continued, not because they were effective, but because they were required. Divine justice is always announced before it is executed. This announcement leaves humanity without excuse. Choice remains available until the final moment. Time moved forward. Generations passed beneath the same patterns. Violence did not lessen. Excess did not retreat. The Nephilim's rule continued. The earth still cried out. Yet humanity's heart remained aligned with power rather than repentance. This chapter opens the sorrowful truth of these days. Warning was given. Truth was spoken. Time was allowed. But humanity chose comfort over correction. And in that choice, the weight carried by the faithful grew heavier. as the world moved steadily toward the judgment it refused to escape. As the years passed, the warnings did not cease. They remained present, steady, and unchanging. They did not grow harsher, nor did they soften to gain acceptance. Truth was offered as it was first given, without alteration. Enoch's words echoed quietly through generations. They spoke of boundaries crossed and consequences sealed. They described judgment as certain, yet patient. His message did not seek to terrify, but to awaken understanding. He reminded humanity that order had existed before corruption, and that it would exist again after it. Few listened. Those who held power dismissed the warnings as weakness. The Nephilim and their authorities saw no threat in quiet voices. Their strength appeared unchallenged. Their empire remained intact. The warnings seemed distant, abstract, and unnecessary. Those beneath power also resisted. Life under domination was harsh but familiar. To turn away required trust in something unseen and unproven. Many chose endurance over change. They adapted to corruption rather than confront it. Over time, even suffering became normal. This normalization was the deepest failure. Violence no longer shocked. Excess no longer offended. Injustice no longer stirred resistance. What once would have demanded correction was now accepted as the order of things. Humanity's conscience dulled under repetition. Noah's life stood apart within this silence. He did not speak often, yet his obedience spoke continuously. He worked under instruction that made little sense to those around him. His labor required patience. It demanded trust in judgment not yet visible. The world watched and mocked. The warnings embodied in his actions were dismissed as foolishness. No immediate consequence followed. Time continued. The sky remained unchanged. The empire persisted. This delay hardened hearts further. Humanity mistook patience for absence. They assumed that silence meant approval. That delay meant escape. The warnings, repeated over years, lost urgency in the minds of many. Familiarity weakened their effect. Yet the faithful did not waver. Those who aligned with truth carried sorrow quietly. They did not withdraw from the world, yet they did not belong to it. They labored, watched, and waited. Their hope was not in immediate change, but in justice that does not fail. This waiting carried weight. To remain faithful while surrounded by corruption required endurance. To speak truth without response required humility. To obey without reward required trust. These qualities did not bring comfort, but they preserved alignment. The warnings continued because they had to. Divine justice does not arrive without witness. The words spoken through Enoch and the obedience lived through Noah stood as testimony. They marked the time. They measured the patience of heaven. Humanity, however, remained unmoved. Power continued to be trusted. Comfort continued to be chosen. The empire's presence dulled the desire for change. Even as violence increased, the promise of stability kept hearts bound. This part of the story reveals a quiet tragedy. The failure was not sudden. It unfolded slowly. Opportunity after opportunity passed unclaimed. Time that had been given for turning was spent in acceptance. Hearts remained unchanged. The faithful watched as the distance between warning and response widened. They understood what was coming, yet they could not force repentance. Choice remained personal, even as consequence approached collectively. Time continued its slow movement. And with each passing year, the sorrow of unheeded warning deepened. As humanity stood firm in its decision to remain within corruption rather than step away from it. As the final years unfolded, the weight of unheeded warning settled fully upon the world. Time, once generous, now carried the heaviness of nearing completion. Yet the rhythm of daily life remained unchanged. Humanity continued as it had, confident in the systems it had built. The warnings had become background noise. What was once unsettling was now familiar. Words that spoke of judgment and correction no longer stirred reflection. The world had learned to live beside truth without responding to it. This was not defiance spoken aloud. It was indifference practiced quietly. Enoch's testimony remained. Though removed from the earth according to ancient memory, his words did not vanish. They endured as witness, preserved against forgetting. His departure itself stood as a sign, though few understood its meaning. Humanity continued without pause. Noah's obedience continued as well. He labored without interruption. Each day passed as another measure of patience. His work stood in the open, visible to all, yet embraced by none beyond his household. This obedience was not fueled by certainty of outcome, but by trust in command. Still, hearts did not change. Humanity's failure was not rooted in lack of warning. It was rooted in choice. Power felt reliable. Comfort felt secure. The Nephilim's presence, though oppressive, had become normal. The cost of turning away seemed greater than the cost of remaining. This choice carried consequence. The sorrow borne by the faithful deepened. They did not rejoice in what was coming. They did not desire judgment. They endured the weight of knowing that justice was approaching, while compassion still called for repentance. This tension marked the final days. The faithful remained few. Their path was narrow, not by exclusion but by refusal of corruption. They carried truth quietly, without force. Their faithfulness did not halt the world's direction, but it stood as testimony against it. Time reached its fullness. The patience of heaven had been extended completely. The warnings had been given. The opportunity to turn had been offered repeatedly. Humanity had chosen comfort over correction, power over trust, familiarity over obedience. The failure was complete. This chapter closes in solemn stillness. There is no rush, no alarm, only the recognition that choice has reached its end. The warnings stand fulfilled in their purpose, even though they were not received. The sore row of unheeded truth rests heavily upon the world. What follows will not come without reason. What follows will not come without warning. The days of warning have passed, and humanity stands within the consequence of its own refusal, as time prepares to give way to judgment already declared. Even as judgment stood ready, mercy did not withdraw. It remained present, not as delay alone, but as intention. Divine justice and divine mercy did not oppose one another. They moved together, each fulfilling its purpose without conflict. Destruction was not the first desire. From the beginning, the preservation of creation had remained central. The earth, though wounded, was not abandoned. Humanity, though corrupted, was not erased without distinction. Within the darkness that had spread across the world, mercy marked a path of continuity. This mercy took the form of preservation. A remnant was identified, not because it was numerous, but because it remained aligned. This remnant was not chosen as escape from judgment, but as carrier of what was meant to endure. Continuity required memory, obedience, and trust preserved through cleansing. Noah stood within this purpose. His obedience, long practiced without reward, now revealed its place. He was not preserved because of strength or insight, but because alignment had been maintained. Mercy did not remove him from the world's reality. It carried him through what was coming. This distinction is essential. Mercy did not deny destruction. It prepared for restoration. Judgment would cleanse what had been distorted. Mercy ensured that what had been rightly formed would not be lost within that cleansing. Creation itself was considered. The earth, which had cried out under violence, was not destined for abandonment. Its suffering was acknowledged. Its restoration was intended. Mercy preserved the seed of renewal even as correction approached. This preservation required separation. Not separation rooted in superiority, but in alignment. The remnant did not stand apart through power. It stood apart through obedience. This obedience was not loud. It was steady, practiced over time, unseen by many. Divine mercy moved quietly. It did not announce itself with spectacle. It prepared. It ordered. It ensured that when cleansing came, it would not end in emptiness. Continuity was woven carefully into the unfolding judgment. This reveals the deeper purpose of mercy. It does not oppose justice, it completes it. Justice removes what cannot remain. Mercy preserves what must continue. Together they restore order. The remnant carried memory of divine order. Through them, creation would not forget its origin. Through them, life would continue beyond corruption. Through them, the earth would be given opportunity to heal. This chapter opens a solemn understanding. Judgment was approaching, certain and necessary, yet mercy remained active within it. What followed would not be annihilation. It would be cleansing shaped by purpose. The presence of mercy ensured that destruction would not have the final word. Continuity had been preserved. And within that preservation, the path toward restoration had already begun to take form, quietly and deliberately, beneath the weight of what was about to unfold. The preservation of mercy required careful preparation. What was to endure could not be chosen at the final moment. It had to be shaped over time, refined through obedience, and held apart from corruption long before destruction arrived. This preparation was not sudden. It unfolded quietly, through instruction given without explanation of outcome. The remnant was guided step by step, not toward escape, but toward continuity. Each act of obedience carried future weight, though its meaning was not yet visible. Mercy worked within discipline. It required trust in command without assurance of comfort. The path of preservation did not remove hardship. It demanded endurance within a world already collapsing under corruption. Mercy did not shield the remnant from sorrow. It sustained alignment through it. This alignment preserved memory. Memory of divine order, memory of restraint, memory of life lived under command rather than control. These memories were not stored in writing alone. They were practiced. They were lived. They were embodied through obedience repeated daily. Such memory could survive cleansing. Divine mercy also preserved structure. What had been distorted would be removed, but the design itself would remain. The rhythms of creation were not abandoned. Seasons would return. Life would begin again. Mercy ensured that the framework of existence was not erased alongside corruption. This is why preservation mattered. Without continuity, restoration would have no anchor. Without memory, renewal would repeat distortion. Mercy guarded against this outcome by ensuring that what remained would remember what had been lost. Justice and mercy moved together. Judgment prepared to cleanse the earth of violence and excess. Mercy prepared to receive what would emerge afterward. Neither acted independently. Both served the same purpose, restoration of order. The remnant did not celebrate preservation. There was no pride in being spared. There was no sense of superiority. Mercy was understood as responsibility, not reward. To endure meant to carry the weight of what had been lost and to begin again with humility. Creation itself waited. The earth, though burdened, was not abandoned. Its future was considered. Mercy held open the possibility of healing. What would be removed was corruption, not creation itself. This part of the story reveals a quiet truth. Mercy does not always appear gentle. It often appears as preparation, discipline, and separation. It does not prevent suffering. It preserves purpose through it. The remnant stood ready, not because destruction was desired, but because restoration required continuity. As judgment approached, mercy remained active, steady, and intentional. Nothing essential would be lost. And within this careful preservation, the path toward cleansing began to take clearer shape, guided not by chaos, but by measured intent aligned with divine order. As the moment of cleansing drew nearer, the presence of mercy became more clearly defined. It did not interrupt judgment. It framed it. What was about to unfold would not erase creation, but correct it. Mercy ensured that the end of one age would also serve as the beginning of another. Destruction was not without boundary. It was measured. It was purposeful. It was directed toward what had become irreconcilable with order. Violence, domination, and corruption would be removed, not because creation had failed, but because it had been violated. Mercy guarded against final loss. The remnant carried within it the seed of renewal, not renewal shaped by power but by obedience, not renewal driven by ambition but by trust. Through this preservation, life would continue without repeating the same descent. This continuity mattered deeply. Without it, cleansing would leave emptiness. With it, cleansing prepared the ground for restoration. Mercy ensured that what emerged afterward would remember restraint, reverence, and alignment. The earth itself stood within this promise. Though scarred, it was not rejected. The soil that had borne violence would be given rest. The waters that had witnessed blood would become instruments of cleansing. Creation would participate in its own renewal. This framing transforms understanding. Judgment was not annihilation. It was correction. Mercy did not deny consequence. It ensured that consequence served restoration rather than final ruin. The faithful understood this quietly. There was no celebration in preservation. There was sorrow for what would be lost. There was reverence for what must be removed. Mercy carried both grief and hope without conflict. This chapter closes in solemn balance. Justice prepared to act. Mercy remained present. Together they held creation within purpose. Nothing essential would be lost. Nothing corrupted would remain. The age of distortion was ending. What followed would cleanse, not destroy without reason. The earth, though weary, would endure. Humanity, though judged, would continue through the remnant preserved. Mercy had done its work. It stood ready alongside judgment, ensuring that when cleansing came, it would open the way toward restoration, and not toward emptiness or silence alone. Here mercy rests, not as escape, but as continuity, quietly carrying creation forward into what must come next. When the waters withdrew and the earth emerged again, the world was not as it had been before. The judgment had passed. The violence that once filled every place was silenced. The empire of domination had fallen beneath the weight of cleansing. Yet absence does not erase memory. The Nephilim no longer walked the earth, but echoes of their age remained. Not in power, not in rule, but in fragments. The world that followed carried impressions of what had been removed, like shadows left after a passing storm. Ancient peoples remembered. They spoke of giants in broken stories. They told of towering beings and mighty rulers whose names carried fear long after their bodies were gone. These accounts did not preserve truth fully. They preserved memory shaped by distance, fear, and confusion. What remained was distortion. The empire itself had been erased. Its cities were gone. Its hierarchies dissolved. The systems built on forbidden knowledge could not endure cleansing. What had been raised without permission could not survive restoration. Yet fragments endured. Ruins lay buried beneath layers of earth and time. Foundations without names remained hidden. Human memory carried impressions without clarity. What once ruled openly became rumor, myth, and legend. This persistence of memory was not accidental. Scripture speaks little of this age, and when it does, it speaks with restraint. This silence is intentional. It prevents revival. It denies corrupted authority the honor of full recounting. What must be remembered is remembered enough. What must not be restored is left incomplete. Remembrance without revival. This balance preserved truth without inviting return. Humanity was not meant to rebuild what had been judged. It was meant to move forward under renewed order, carrying awareness of past transgression without repeating it. Giant traditions appeared among many cultures. They differed in form but shared a common shadow. Stories of beings larger than life. Tales of ancient rulers who shaped the world before great waters came. These stories did not align fully with one another. They reflected fragments of a single truth, scattered by time. These echoes served as warning. They reminded humanity that power once misused brought destruction. They testified to judgment that had already occurred. They stood as quiet markers of a boundary never to be crossed again. The earth itself bore these echoes. Landscapes changed. Regions once inhabited lay empty. The rhythm of life began again upon cleansed ground, but the memory of what had been removed lingered beneath the surface. This chapter opens a reflective silence. The flood had answered corruption. Mercy had preserved continuity. Now the world stood renewed, yet not untouched by memory. What had been erased left behind faint impressions, enough to remember, not enough to revive. The Nephilim world was gone. Its echo remained. As generations passed, memory continued to fragment. What had once been lived reality became distant account. Time softened detail. Fear reshaped narrative. The truth of the Nephilim age did not disappear, but it changed form. Humanity remembered without understanding. Stories were told beside fires and carried across lands. They spoke of ancient beings whose strength defied measure, of rulers who shaped the earth before waters covered it. These stories varied, yet they shared a common sense of loss and warning. What they lacked was clarity. The details of the Nephilim world were not preserved fully. This absence was deliberate. Scripture does not dwell on the structures, names, or achievements of that empire. It does not invite admiration or curiosity. Its restraint protects against repetition. Silence can guard wisdom. By withholding full account, sacred record ensures that corrupted authority cannot be reclaimed through fascination. What is not described cannot be rebuilt. What is not detailed cannot be imitated. The memory remains incomplete by design. Ruins beneath the earth testified quietly. Foundations buried deep beneath sediment hinted at a world that once stood taller than memory allowed. These remnants did not explain themselves. They invited speculation, not certainty. Humanity encountered traces without instruction. This distance was mercy. It prevented the forbidden from regaining form. It allowed humanity to acknowledge what had been without possessing it. Knowledge of the past remained fragmented enough to warn, not enough to empower. Giant traditions persisted across cultures. They emerged in different lands, separated by language and time. Each tradition spoke of an ancient age before catastrophe. Each described beings of unusual strength and rule. None preserved the full truth. Each reflected memory shaped by fear and awe. These echoes did not glorify. They unsettled. They reminded. They cautioned. They suggested that power once walked the earth and brought destruction upon itself. The flood remained the dividing line in these accounts, marking the end of that age. Humanity rebuilt cautiously. Life resumed with new rhythms. Authority was re-established under divine guidance. Boundaries were reinforced. The world moved forward, shaped by renewal rather than dominance. Yet memory remained beneath the surface. The earth carried scars invisible to many. The soil had been cleansed, but its history was not erased entirely. The land remembered what had pressed upon it. Creation, once again aligned, held quiet awareness. This part of the chapter reflects a sober truth. What is judged is removed. What is remembered is restrained. The Nephilim world did not vanish without trace. It was allowed to fade into fragments, ensuring that its power could not return. The echoes remained as warning, not invitation. Humanity was permitted to remember that boundaries once crossed led to ruin, but it was protected from the knowledge that might tempt crossing again. Scripture's silence stands as safeguard. It closes the door gently, without spectacle. It allows the past to rest without revival. It invites reflection without fascination. And so the echoes continued, quiet and incomplete, guiding memory toward humility rather than curiosity, toward caution rather than longing. As time moved further from the age of judgment, the echoes softened still more. What had once been near enough to remember became distant enough to question. Humanity carried the past as impression rather than record, as shadow rather than form. This softening was intentional. What had been removed was not meant to return, even in thought. The silence preserved in sacred text guarded the future by limiting the past. Memory remained, but it was restrained, held within safe bounds. Remembrance without revival became the rule. The Nephilim were not named in detail. Their cities were not described. Their knowledge was not recorded. Scripture chose absence where curiosity might have grown. This absence was not loss. It was protection. The fragments that remained served a single purpose. They reminded humanity that there had been an age before judgment, and that it ended for a reason. They testified that power once exceeded its boundary, and that consequence followed. They did not invite investigation. They invited humility. Cultures continued to speak of giants. These accounts varied, shaped by language and landscape. Some spoke of towering ancestors, others of fallen heroes, some of monsters destroyed by the gods. All shared the sense that something vast and dangerous had once existed and was no longer permitted. None of these accounts restored authority. They carried awe without instruction, fear without detail, memory without blueprint. This ensured that what had been judged could not be reconstructed through fascination or imitation. The earth itself reflected this restraint. Its landscapes bore no clear markers pointing back to the empire that once ruled. Cleansing had removed dominion and erased hierarchy. What remained was ground ready for renewed life, not monuments to past corruption. Humanity lived forward. Life unfolded under renewed order. Boundaries were clearer. Authority was reshaped. Memory of judgment encouraged caution. The world moved with awareness that power misused had already been answered once. This awareness mattered. It shaped reverence. It restrained ambition. It reminded humanity that creation is not endlessly permissive. Some lines, once crossed, bring correction so complete that only echoes remain. This chapter closes in quiet reflection. The Nephilim world did not vanish without witness, but it did not endure with honor. Its memory was reduced to fragments, scattered and incomplete. This was not neglect, it was wisdom. What must be remembered was remembered enough. What must never return was denied form. The echoes after the flood remain as gentle warnings carried through time. They speak softly, not to awaken fear, but to preserve humility. They remind humanity that the world once suffered under corrupted authority, and that such authority was removed. The past rests now, incomplete and distant. And in that restraint, creation is protected, guided forward by memory that cautions rather than invites, and by silence that preserves what must remain at rest. When the echoes of the past have settled and memory rests without longing, one question remains. It does not rise in accusation, nor does it demand defense. It waits quietly, shaped by reflection rather than urgency. Why was the ancient empire permitted to rise at all? The answer is not found in haste. Heaven does not act from impulse. What unfolds across ages is measured beyond human sight. Divine patience is not absence of power, but restraint guided by purpose. The Most High does not prevent every turning at its beginning. He allows choice to reveal its full nature. Free will carries weight. It was given not as ornament, but as responsibility. Angels were not created without choice. Humanity was not formed without agency. Obedience, to be true, must be chosen. Order, to endure, must be embraced freely. The ancient empire revealed what happens when that freedom is turned away from alignment. The Watchers were not forced into rebellion. They were not deceived. They chose fascination over restraint, unity over obedience, action over command. Their choice unfolded slowly, deliberately, without coercion. The Nephilim were not accidents of creation. They were outcomes. They stood as visible consequence of boundaries crossed knowingly. Their empire did not emerge because heaven failed to prevent it. It emerged because heaven allowed choice to reach its full expression. This allowance served revelation. Corruption, when hidden, invites repetition. Corruption, when revealed fully, teaches restraint. The ancient world saw what power without obedience becomes. It saw what knowledge without wisdom produces. It saw what authority without permission destroys. This lesson could not be learned in theory. It required history. It required time. It required consequence visible enough to be remembered, yet restrained enough to prevent revival. Heaven allowed the empire so that its end would speak more clearly than its beginning. Divine patience allowed the fullness of corruption to appear. Not because it was desired, but because it needed to be exposed. Partial rebellion leaves room for doubt. Complete revelation removes excuse. When judgment came, it came upon a record made clear. The empire's rise revealed the cost of crossing sacred boundaries. The flood revealed the response. This pattern is woven throughout divine history. Freedom is given space. Choice is allowed depth. Judgment follows clarity, not suspicion. In this way, justice remains unquestioned. The ancient empire stands as lesson rather than mystery. It demonstrates that heaven does not rule through constant interruption. It governs through order sustained by patience. When that order is rejected fully, correction follows fully. This understanding does not invite fear. It invites rest. Nothing unfolds outside permission. Nothing escapes awareness. Even corruption serves a purpose it does not intend. Heaven remains watchful, steady, and unmoved by time's passing. The allowance of the ancient empire does not reveal weakness. It reveals confidence in order. What was permitted did not endure. What endured was alignment. What was allowed to rise was allowed to fall. What was preserved was creation itself. This chapter begins to settle the question. Heaven allowed the ancient empire so that its cost would be unmistakable, its end decisive, and its memory restrained. The lesson was written once. It does not need repetition. And as reflection deepens, the mind is invited not toward debate, but toward stillness, where understanding rests quietly beneath the enduring watchfulness of heaven. Divine patience is often misunderstood when measured by human urgency. What appears as delay is not uncertainty. It is allowance shaped by wisdom beyond immediate sight. Heaven does not hurry truth. It allows truth to unfold until it stands without confusion. The ancient empire was permitted to reveal the full nature of corrupted authority. Had it been ended at its first emergence, its danger might have remained hidden. Power restrained too early can appear harmless. Knowledge interrupted too soon can seem innocent. Heaven allowed the empire to mature so that its outcome would speak plainly. What emerged was not ambiguity. Violence filled the world. Excess consumed the land. Authority became domination. Knowledge became destruction. The earth itself cried out under the weight of it. No argument remained. No justification endured. Free will had completed its course. The Watchers had chosen unity in rebellion. Humanity had chosen comfort over correction. The Nephilim embodied the result. Each choice stood visible. Each consequence followed naturally. Judgment did not interrupt this process. It concluded it. This completion matters. Justice that arrives too early can be questioned. Justice that arrives after full revelation is understood. Heaven allowed the ancient empire to stand long enough that its fall would be recognized as necessary rather than arbitrary. This is the nature of divine instruction. Lessons written into history are not repeated endlessly. They are written once with clarity. The ancient empire became such a lesson. Its rise and fall marked a boundary for all ages that followed. Sacred boundaries were defined. The separation between heaven and earth was reinforced. The limits of knowledge were clarified. Authority was reestablished as something entrusted, not seized. These truths did not need constant repetition. They were sealed by consequence. Heaven's watchfulness did not waver during this time. Allowance does not mean distance. Silence does not mean absence. The Most High remained attentive throughout every stage. The rise of corruption did not escape notice. It was permitted under observation, not neglect. This watchfulness ensured proportion. Judgment did not exceed what was required. Mercy preserved what must continue. Destruction removed what could not remain. Balance was restored without excess. The ancient empire also revealed something quieter. Corruption does not collapse on its own. It must be answered. Allowance has an end. Patience has completion. Heaven does not abandon creation to disorder indefinitely. This truth brings calm. History is not uncontrolled. Time is not unobserved. Even when corruption rises, it does so within boundaries it cannot escape. Its end is already known, even as it unfolds. This understanding reshapes the final question. Heaven allowed the ancient empire not because it approved of it, but because its exposure would protect the future. The cost of crossing sacred boundaries was displayed fully so that restraint would endure long after the empire faded. The lesson was given once. It stands complete. As reflection deepens, urgency fades. The need to resolve every detail quiets. What remains is understanding settled into place, steady and sufficient. The ancient empire passed. Order remained. And heaven continues to watch, not with anxiety, but with unbroken clarity, guiding history toward rest rather than repetition. When the lesson had been written and the record sealed, history moved forward under renewed order. The ancient empire did not linger as threat. It remained only as memory restrained, caution preserved, and silence kept where detail might invite return. This restraint is itself an answer. Heaven allowed what needed to be seen, and then ensured that it would not be repeated. What was exposed was corrected. What was corrected was not restored. The balance between allowance and removal was complete. Divine watchfulness endures beyond judgment. It is not reactive. It does not tire. It remains constant across ages. What was learned in the ancient world continues to shape the boundaries that protect creation. The separation between realms remains firm. Authority remains defined. Knowledge remains measured. Free will remains present. Heaven did not remove choice after the ancient empire. It refined understanding. Humanity was not stripped of agency. It was given clarity. The cost of misuse had been shown. The path of restraint had been preserved. This is how instruction endures. Not through constant intervention, but through lessons complete enough to remain relevant. The ancient empire became such a lesson. It spoke without urgency. It warned without repetition. It rested within history as boundary, not burden. The final understanding offered here is quiet. Heaven allowed the ancient empire so that creation would not question the justice of its removal, so that freedom would be seen as gift, not risk alone, so that obedience would be understood as protection, not limitation. This understanding does not demand response. It invites rest. Nothing remains unresolved. Nothing stands unfinished. What was permitted has ended. What was preserved continues. The earth moves forward under order restored. Humanity continues under boundaries clarified. Heaven remains watchful. Not in suspicion, but in care. Not in haste, but in patience. The same patience that allowed choice to unfold also ensures that order will endure. As the narrative closes, attention returns to stillness. The ancient questions no longer press for answers. They have been met with understanding. History rests where it belongs, no longer unfolding, no longer threatening. What remains is quiet assurance. Order has not failed. Justice has not been absent. Mercy has not been withdrawn. Heaven allowed the ancient empire to rise so that its fall would speak once, clearly, and without need for repetition. And now, with the lesson complete, creation rests beneath the enduring watchfulness of heaven, where all things move according to purpose, and nothing disturbs the quiet balance that remains. Closing. The story now comes gently to rest. What was hidden has been revealed only as much as was needed. What was broken has been addressed. What was allowed has passed into memory, no longer stirring, no longer calling for return. The ancient world has spoken its lesson and has fallen. End silent. The earth rests beneath renewed order. The heavens remain watchful. Nothing moves without purpose. Nothing unfolds without permission. Even the darkest ages were held within boundaries unseen, guided toward an end already known. Corruption was allowed to rise so that it could be answered fully. Judgment came not in haste, but in clarity. Mercy did not disappear, but carried life forward through cleansing. What remains now is stillness. The questions that once troubled the mind no longer press for resolution. They have been answered by time, by consequence, and by restoration. The ancient empire does not return. The watchers do not descend again. The Nephilim do not walk the earth. Their age has closed, complete and unrepeated. Memory remains only as warning, not as invitation. The rhythm of creation continues, slow and measured. Night follows day. Seasons pass without urgency. The order set in the beginning endures, guarded quietly, faithfully. Heaven does not sleep, yet it does not rush. Its watchfulness is calm, steady, and unbroken. In this quiet rest is found. The mind may loosen its grip on understanding. The weight of ancient consequence no longer needs to be carried. What mattered has been spoken. What needed to be removed has been removed. What was preserved continues gently onward. Let the thoughts settle like dust after the waters recede. Let memory fade where it is no longer needed. The story has been told as it was meant to be told, not to stir fear, not to provoke striving, but to restore perspective, humility, and peace. All things return to order. All things move toward rest. And beneath the enduring watchfulness of heaven, the world grows quiet once more, held in balance, waiting without tension, resting without end.